Hello, everyone. This is Dylan from Musician on a Mission. I'm so excited to be coming to you live to do an EQ workshop on the painter technique, which is a EQ system that basically allows you to fully EQ your entire mix from start to finish. There's no more, going through and having to make, one tiny little tweak or one tiny little problem solve randomly without actually understanding what you're doing, why you're doing it. So before we get started, I do want to make sure, as always, let me know if you can see me. Let me know if you can hear me. Just let me know in the comments. I'm going to be playing my DAW in just a moment to make sure that all of you can hear that audio as well. So once you hear it, let me know, and we will be getting started. Great, so it sounds like everything is coming through. So I'm going to hit play and let me know in the comments if you can hear my DAW okay, if it's all coming through clear.
Quiet now without you, but you're ringing through the silence. All these nights we spent together, they've left me.
Great. So it looks like everything is working. Very excited about that. So we are going to get started in that case. Like I said, I am just so excited to be sharing this with you. So this might be a little bit... Uh-oh, hold on. I unplugged my headphones. That's very important. Oh, the joys of live streaming. I can't stop and edit that out. Usually I get to edit all that stuff out of the video. Oh well. So this is going to be a little bit of a different system than maybe the one that you are used to. So at Musician on a Mission, we teach basically EQ as problem solving. So you're listening, you're using your ears, you're listening to everything in context, and you are using your ears to pick out like, okay, that part of the frequency spectrum sounds harsh, or like, the snare is peaking out in the upper mids, and so I need to go in and cut that, or like, oh, this is too dark, so I need to boost the boost the top end. And while that is all well and good, that is absolutely one of the central tenets of EQ. I think it's a little short-sighted to look at EQ from only one perspective, and that's problem solving. So that's why I actually came up with the painter method, which I'll go through in just a moment. But it's basically a system that you can use whenever you are mixing, that you can go through step by step to make sure that you have done everything you could possibly need to do with your EQ, while getting the best possible results, while making sure everything is cleaned, making sure things like the tone of all of your instruments is great, making sure everything is sticking together, is fitting well together in the mix, making sure that your general EQ curve, is similar to the sound, the tone of your reference tracks. Basically, I don't need to tell you that EQ is an incredibly important tool, but I also don't need to tell you that whenever you're learning to do EQ, it just gets so confusing and overwhelming. So that's why I made this particular system. Today, we are going to be working with this mix. It's called Boogie Nights by the band Adventureland. It's actually not out yet. And I picked this particular mix because this band basically recorded all of this in their living room. And that's most likely the tracks that you are all going to be working with. You're not going to have studio quality recordings. You're going to have stuff that you did in your living room, and you're going to have to deal with it. So understanding how to do EQing with less than perfectly recorded tracks, even though the song is great, that's going to be huge. So we're going to be using this particular track. I have not done any mixing at all. I'm not going to be doing any compression. I'm not going to be doing any reverbs or anything like that. So once we get to the end of this process, this mix isn't going to be finished by any stretch. But it is going to be 50% of the way there. All of the frequency stuff is going to be done, and then I can move on and do whatever else I want to do. So, all that being said, let's dive right into the painter method. And if anybody has any questions at all, feel free to comment in the comments. There's a little bit of a delay. I think there's like a 20 or 30-second delay in the stream. So it'll take a little bit for me to see it, but I'd love to back up, explain something again. If there's something you don't quite understand, I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page as we go through this system. So, all right, let's get into it. So, the painter method. So this whole technique is centered around the metaphor of a painter. So I want you to imagine something with me. So I want you to imagine a painter who is trying to capture the countryside on his canvas or her canvas. Let's say they're out and they've got their easel and they've got their canvas, and there's there's a country church right in front of them, and maybe there's like out in the distance in the valley is a little village, and there's trees and mountains and beautiful foliage, and they want to capture all of that on their canvas. Now, obviously that's a lot. That's a lot of detail. They're seeing tons and tons of information. Things they're seeing like a mile away from them. They're seeing the village a mile away from them, and they're seeing, the country church that's literally right next to them. So they have to go through the process of not only, making sure that they're prepared to paint, not only making sure that, they've got their shapes right, that they've got their colors right, but they've also got to make sure that they've got their shading right so that the things that are close seem close and the things that are far away seem far away. So the process of a painter painting this countryside is actually the same process, roughly speaking, that you are going to be going through to do your EQ in your mix. So this is a 5-step system. It's 5 steps. And each step obviously focuses on a different moment in EQ. Now, some of these steps can be done all in one EQ plugin. I'm most likely going to be separating them out just to make it easier for you to see. But here are the 5 steps. And we're going to go through each step in more detail in a moment. But I just want to give this to you. If you're taking notes, which take notes, here's what you want to write down. So step 1 is to clean your tracks, or step 1 is to prepare your paints. And like I said, I'll get into the metaphor of all this in a little bit. That's where you're going to be doing any of your surgery EQ to clean up your tracks, to get rid of any room resonances, to get rid of any serious harshness. Then there is step 2, which is to enhance your tracks, or step 2 is to sketch each object on the canvas. And that's where we are going to be going instrument by instrument and enhancing the tones of the instrument, balancing the tones of the instrument. Then there is step 3, and that is to balance the overall tone of the mix. Or if you're looking at it through the metaphor, step 3 is to paint the canvas, put color on the canvas. That is going to be our mix bus EQ. So that's the EQ that we're going to be putting on the entire mix bus, and we'll be talking about that in just a moment. Then there is step 4, and that's to create space for your instruments to live in. Or step 4 is to create depth with shading, to make sure that the country church looks up close to you, looks like it's very close to you, and the village in the bottom of the valley looks like it's far away, rather than all of the colors just looking like they're in the exact same two-dimensional space. And then finally, there is step 5, which is to make your final tweaks. That is going to be you doing your problem solving. That's going to be you listening with your ears and saying, okay, I've made the best foundation I possibly can. Now let me go in, listen to my ears, use my ears, and listen to the mix and say, okay, what's still not fitting? So that is the 5 steps. Now, in terms of a more classical mix, when I say classical, I mean like the average way you would do a mix. Step 1, which is cleaning your tracks, is more on the prep side, as is step 2. Whereas step 3, 4, and 5 are more something that you would do during your actual mixing sessions. So, all this being said, like I said, let me know in the comments if anything is confusing right now. But let's go into more depth on each particular step. Give me just a moment to rehydrate. Okay, so step 1, clean your tracks or prepare your paints. So in terms of the metaphor that we're going for, in terms of the painter method, obviously when the painter gets out of their car and goes to the side of the hill, they have to physically set up their workstation. They've got to put their easel up. They have to put their canvas up. They've got to figure out the view that they want. And they have to prepare their paints. They've got to look at the view and they've got to say, okay, I know I'm going to need some greens, and I know I'm going to need some yellows, and I know I'm going to need some purples, and I'll do some mixing and stuff like that. They are preparing all of their tools to make sure that once they get started, they're going to be able to work without having to stop and fix things. So in terms of EQ, what we're saying is we want to prepare our tracks and get rid of anything that is just so obviously wrong that if we were to wait until the mix, we would be far beyond we would be far beyond where we would need to be to get rid of this stuff. To put it in a different way that makes more sense, because honestly that was kind of gibberish. We're trying to cut stuff where when we listen to it, we're like, oh yeah, this is obviously a problem. I can just get rid of it now. I don't have to wait until stage 5. I don't have to wait until I got to tweak and do problem solving. I can just do it right now. So primarily what that means is that we are going to be cutting out room resonances. And room resonances are, for anyone who doesn't know, these are frequencies that bounce off of the room around you, bounce off of all the walls, maybe, hits a parallel wall and gets stuck. And that particular frequency just gets extra loud. For some reason, it just gets and it will boost itself way more than the rest of the frequencies around it. This is especially prominent in home recording than it is in studios, because studios have really scientifically, acoustically designed and treated rooms to make sure that room resonances don't happen. But if you're recording in your living room or your bedroom, because that's all you have, you're probably going to get some room resonances. Maybe you'll luck out and you won't, but there's a good chance you will. Sometimes you'll also get resonances that aren't because of the room. Oftentimes acoustic instruments will naturally have resonances that will become more prominent based on where you set the microphone. So, great example of this is the acoustic guitar. So, a lot of times, the sound hole that is on the edge of the acoustic guitar, that is basically a natural resonator. You strum a G chord and all of the sound waves get caught in there and bounce around and then pop out, and it makes it sound a lot louder than it otherwise would, and then it also changes the tone as well. It's part of the reason that electric guitars are so quiet, so they don't have those really, really big natural resonators. But that's literally in the name, resonator. So sometimes certain frequencies will just, for whatever reason, because of the shape of the guitar or like the type of strings you're using or where you place the mic, certain frequencies will get stuck in there, bounce around, and will just sound extremely loud. And they won't even deal with the chord you're playing. You'll just hear one note, just boo, that'll just be in every chord you play. So we are wanting to be on the lookout for those types of rogue frequencies that we can cut pretty much off the bat. So I'm going to give one quick disclaimer here. I'm actually going to give you, Wizard of Oz, little peek behind the curtain. I done messed up. I had the time zones of this live stream wrong. So this was the mix that we were going to use for the workshop. But I actually have already done most of the cleaning for this mix before I created this particular session. I was going to drag in the original tracks, between now and the hour that I thought that this live stream was going to be at. Did not have time. So that's my bad. That's just a classic time zone confusion. So we're going to be looking for resonances. They're not going to be quite as prominent as they would have been if I had dragged in the correct tracks. But if nothing else, if we can't find any, then I can basically create one and show you how you would fix this kind of problem if a particular room resonance was already there. So, and again, let me know if I'm going too fast. Let me know if you need me to back up and cover anything again. So right now we have only a few instruments. We have our background vocals, we have our lead vocals, we have a single synth drone, we have a lot of different electric guitars, we've got a bass guitar, and we've got a drum set. Pretty simple. Nothing really too out there. It's kind of your simple indie rock setup. So what we would want to do first, whenever we're doing this first step, is we would want to go instrument by instrument, solo it out, listen to it, and see if we hear any frequencies that are just sounding extra loud. And the more you do this, the easier you'll be able to hear. I will teach you a technique in just a moment to do if you really haven't figured out what resonant frequencies sound like, and it'll help you find them. So let's just listen first and see if we hear anything. I'm going to just solo out the drums. Oh, actually, before we do that, definitely should have done this first. This is funny. Let me show you a quick before and after. Right now, I actually have done our system on this mix. And so I'm going to go and I'm going to turn all of the processing off. Hold on one moment. Here we go. Let me pop you over here. Okay. I'm going to turn all the processing off. And I want you to hear the before and after of what this mix sounds like. So, this is before we've done any of this system, any of this EQing. So here's before. Okay, really dark, everything's kind of meshing together, pretty difficult to hear certain instruments. Now, let me turn all the processing on and you'll hear the difference immediately.
Now without you, but you're ringing through the silence. All these nights we spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're ringing.
You hear how that just immediately sounds like a mix. You know, the background vocals just pop out of your speakers based on where they were before. And, you know, the lead vocals, they still sound kind of rough. They were recorded in a very live living room, you know, but they sound at least fairly balanced. And, you know, the drums just seem like they're hitting so much harder. I'm going to just do a before and after, and I'm going to go a lot faster so you could hear the difference kind of in the moment. Because if you can really learn how to use this system, I mean, this is going to change everything for you. So here's before. Here's after. Before. And after. And that's with no other processing. There's been no compression. There's been no reverbs, no delays, no effects, no saturation. This is just EQ. Just EQ, nothing else. So John's saying, is this not the mix session track that we've been working with? So John, with the people who are in this live stream from the membership, this is the same song. However, this is different processing because the stuff that we worked with in our studio session, I wasn't necessarily using this system because we were doing everything. We were doing the compression, the EQ, the delays, the reverbs, so on and so forth. So this will just be a different way of looking at this same song. So yeah, that's the difference. That's where we're starting. I'm going to turn all of this off. We are going to start from ground zero. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we are just going to listen to the drums and we'll see if anything is poking out. That's just toms. So nothing's really poking out in that. So let's go and check out this guitar. Fresh Meat, I see that you're talking about 3 instances of FabFilter Pro Q on a single bus. Isn't that some serious CPU hog? Honestly, FabFilter doesn't take up nearly as much CPU as I would expect. That said, I do have a pretty solid computer. Not everyone's going to be able to do that. I'm only using a ton of FabFilter Pro Q because I can, but you can do this with a stock plugin. Like it's the exact same system. So yeah, you can see I've got a lot of FabFilter stuff on this whole session. Anyway, so you can actually see I do have a resonance cut right here at about 450 roughly. So I'm going to grab another EQ, and I want to show everyone how you can find a resonance if you can't really hear one. It looks like Fresh Meat actually hit on this with his little spoilers comment. It is going to be a sweep EQ. Let me get this right. So, pretty much what you want to do if you're like, oh man, I'm trying to hear a resonance. I think there's a resonance, but I can't really tell where it is. You're going to create an EQ band. You're going to set it to not a particularly wide Q, somewhere between 2 and 4. You're going to boost it up by, somewhere between 12 and 24 decibels. And then we are just going to slowly sweep through the frequency spectrum until we hear something that just really jumps out to our ears. Yeah, so I'm definitely kind of hearing something around here. Hear that? Doo, 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 doo. I'll keep going now. There we go, okay. I got the spinning beach ball of death. Oh no! Well, isn't this unfortunate? Tech issues. Well, that's okay. It solved itself, or not. So while this is solving itself, it's interesting. This happened on Saturday with the studio session that I did with our members. For some reason, my computer does not like live streaming and doing big old mixes. So we might have to pause from time to time to just sort of almost let my computer buffer, if that makes sense. Regardless, so we kind of heard it more sitting around kind of 300 to 500. Usually room resonances live in that area. They're kind of between 100 and 1,000. They're not usually, super up in the upper mids or the highs or anything like that. They tend to live between 100 and 1,000 hertz. So once you sort of find the area, I'm actually going to make an even thinner Q, and we're going to sweep around a little bit more. Well, this is unfortunate. Well, we're just going to try to power through this weird MIDI thing. I'm actually just going to restart Logic, and we'll come right back to this step. But while I'm restarting Logic, we'll just keep talking about what we're going to be doing here in the future. Hold on just a moment. So, as we sweep around that area, okay, this is open back up. Let me actually turn all of the processing off real quick, and then we'll get started again. Okay. So when we're sweeping around this area, we're really looking for, one or two particular notes to stick out. Usually room resonances tend to be either a very small range of notes or just one rogue note that is just there no matter what chord is being played. So let's just move this around a little bit. I'm going to make this cue even thinner, and we'll see what we hear. Yeah, to me right here is sounding real rough. So I'm going to go in and cut this. Not that much. So let me quickly show you a before and after. So I've cut this about, 12 decibels. Still a pretty tight cue. I know it doesn't look that tight on this FabFilter EQ, but a cue of 5 is pretty tight. So let's do a before and after. So this is going to bypass this. So here's, we'll do after first for resonances. It's more obvious. So here's after. So just sounds like a guitar. Here's before. Here you just hear the doo, 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 doo. That's super loud whenever I take that out. All of a sudden it just pops into your ears. It's like, oh my God, I cannot unhear that. So here's after. And here's before. Yep, this is what we're hearing right here. So that is what a resonance sounds like. It's just something that it's a very specific note. It doesn't really sound like, an amalgamation of a bunch of frequencies. It just sounds like one boop, 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 boop. And you are trying to cut that to get rid of it, just to balance the sound out. Obviously, me making that dramatic of a cut, that's a very dramatic cut, didn't hurt the sound of this electric guitar at all. In fact, it helped it. I mean, it just made it sound like a regular electric guitar rather than something that, once you do a bunch of compression, you do a bunch of other processing, that note is going to stick out a lot more. So very, very helpful. Looks like John has a question. So earlier question, if your acoustic guitar has a buildup in PUPs, I'm not sure what PUPs is, and you go direct in, what is the risk of resonance? John, I'm not totally sure what you mean by PUPs, but if you're going direct in, risk of resonance, pickups, duh, P-ups. Y'all, I'm also a guitarist. You'd think I'd know that. Yes, if your acoustic guitar has pickups, you go direct in. What's the risk of resonance? It's still there a little bit. It's a lot less because usually when guitar makers put in pickups, they are aware of the potential resonances that could happen in that guitar. So they're either going to choose pickups that don't accentuate that resonance, place a certain pickup in an area of the guitar that is not going to accentuate that resonance, or they're going to design their guitar to not have such a huge resonance that it's going to pop out, in a direct pickup. I mean, that's really problematic if you plug direct in and there's just a super obvious resonance. It can happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, especially if you're in a very lively room, a very lively small room especially. But you are definitely minimizing the risk of it a lot more. That said, for me, sometimes I would want to mic my acoustic guitar and then get rid of the resonance, then go direct in on an acoustic guitar. I usually don't like the sound of direct in acoustic guitar, but that's a personal question or excuse me, personal opinion. So Fresh Meat has a question. So off topic a little, but I'm so hoping there's some FabFilter discounts around Black Friday. I'd love to buy FabFilter Essentials bundle. Okay, so this isn't a question. This is a statement. Yes. I'm really big on the fact that you can do everything we're talking about with your stock plugins. So many people think that you're not able to do any kind of mixing if you don't go out and spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on premium plugins. The faster that you can get rid of your gas, your gear acquisition syndrome, the faster that you're going to just get better at mixing. That said, once you've mastered using the tools you have, once you've mastered using your stock plugins, then allow yourself to go out and buy some third-party plugins, buy some premium plugins. FabFilter, I don't think they've ever made a bad plugin. In fact, some of their plugins are, I agree with Fresh Meat. Some of their plugins are the best in the industry. But I wouldn't go out, you've mixed for 2 months and you decide to blow $1,000 on the FabFilter Essentials bundle. I would wait until you're good at mixing and you've reached a threshold where you're not going to get any better unless you start spending money, because there's a lot of work before you're ever going to get to that threshold. There's a lot of learning, there's a lot of practice, there's a lot of releases. There's a lot you can do without ever touching FabFilter. But once you get to a certain point, I'm with Fresh Meat. I couldn't recommend FabFilter enough once you're at that point. So anyway, back on the topic that we're on, that's what a resonance sounds like. That's how you can fix a resonance. Since I've already gone in and cut a lot of resonances out of this mix, I'm just going to skip. I'm going to skip going through the rest of these instruments just for time's sake, as I have already done them. And we are going to move on to step 2, which is to enhance your instruments, enhance your tracks, or step 2 is to sketch each object. So going back to the painter method, let's think about our painter who's sitting on the countryside. Now they have officially cleaned their tool. They've cleaned their brushes. They've gotten their colors ready. They've set up their workstation. Everything is cleaned and prepped and ready. So now they have to actually put pen to paper. So the first thing they're going to do before they do any colors is they are going to make a pencil sketch of each object. They can't necessarily do any kind of shapes if they don't at least have a general outline of what they're going to be filling in. So they'd want to, make a sketch of this little country church. They'd want to make a sketch of the village far away, make a sketch of the trees around them and the mountainside and the flowers that are next to them. They're not adding any color. They're not adding any shading. To a certain extent, this is the step where they focus the most on each individual object. They're wanting to make sure that that sketch is right, that the shape of the tree is exactly the shape of the tree, or the shape of the building is exactly the shape of the building. Now, for any art heads, my mom is actually a painter, so any art heads who are immediately like, well, you don't have to do that. I mean, that's just if you're wanting to recreate it exactly. Fair. We'll just assume that you're trying to recreate it exactly for the metaphor. My mom is an impressionist painter, and I actually told her about this system, and she was like, well, I don't do that. And I was like, well, yeah, but you paint super vague things. So we're assuming that we're making a very accurate painting in this situation. So yeah, if you're going through and you're sketching each object, you're really focusing in on each object. What that means in terms of EQ is before we're starting on the whole mix, before we are going in and making sure that everything fits together, we're just going to focus on each object. We're going to sketch each object to make sure that it sounds the best that it can. Now, this is especially necessary and useful for people who are new to recording, for people who are recording in pretty rough spaces, pretty bad spaces, which is, I mean, if you're doing home recording, you're obviously just working with what you have. This is for people who are maybe doing everything direct in. Maybe they don't want to deal with the room sound, so they're doing all of their, their acoustic guitars are direct in, their piano is electric, stuff like that. This is kind of the case if you are doing electronic music. You might not have to do this, honestly, if you're just using synths, because part of the thing with synths, and this is a little off subject, but it's important to know, the methodology for EQing electronic music is different than the methodology for EQing, I'll just call it acoustic music, which is really just anything that is an electronic music. Now, the reason for that, it's not because the frequencies are different or anything like that. It's just that, a guitar exists in the world. And so whenever I'm mixing, I'm trying to make my recorded guitar sound like the guitar would sound in the world. Whereas synthesizers don't exist in the world. They don't exist in a space outside of a computer, or outside of, obviously, an analog synthesizer. But regardless, I'm essentially able to shape the sound of a synthesizer to be literally anything I want it to be. So going in and enhancing the tone of the synths, you definitely can, but you're not necessarily starting with a bad tone like you might be if you're trying to record your own stuff at home. So this step is a little bit more optional. The last step is also optional. If you have killer recordings or you recorded everything in a really nice studio, probably don't need to go into the last step either. It's a good habit to get into, but if everything sounds great, everything sounds great. You don't need to prep, because this is basically still a bit of prep. I'm not going to be doing any of this while I'm mixing. This is before the mix. So for anyone, actually, this is a great way of looking at this. For anyone who is used to kind of old style recording or professional style recording, we'll just stick with old style. So back in the day, big, fancy, multi-million-dollar studios, you would go out into the tracking room. The engineer would come out and set up the microphones around the instrument and, get the sound they want. Would go back in to the soundboard. They'd listen to the sound. Let's say, it's an acoustic guitar. They'd listen to the acoustic guitar through the speakers, and they'd say, okay, I've gotten the best sound I can get using the microphone, but it's still not there. So I'm going to use a little bit of EQ. So they'd go into the board and they'd tweak the EQ knobs and they'd get it to where the instrument was sounding the best it could. Now that EQ was basically getting burned into the tape. So they couldn't take that EQ out later. It wasn't a plugin that they could just bypass if they later were just like, I don't really like that. It was baked in. It was essentially a part of the sound of the instrument. That's actually why it was called pre-tape EQ. It was EQ that was done before tape. So once the mix started, it was on there no matter what. Now, almost all pre-tape EQ was this tonal EQ that I'm talking about. It was the engineer going in and saying, it needs to be brighter. I can't make it brighter by going and messing with the microphone or the position or anything like that. So I'm just going to use an EQ and make it brighter. And then whoever's mixing it can do what they want with it. I just want the potential of that instrument to be as high as it possibly can before the mixing engineer gets their hands on it. So this is a rare moment when I actually would recommend you doing this in solo, which is pretty crazy if you've been following us for a really long time. We are really big, we at Musician on a Mission, really, really big on always doing EQ in context of the mix. You always want to hear what the sounds that you're changing sound like in context of the rest of the instruments. Because sometimes you can make something sound amazing in solo, and then you play it with the rest of the mix, and it sounds terrible. And vice versa, sometimes you can make something sound awful in solo, and you play it with the rest of the mix, maybe because you EQ'd it in context of the mix, and it sounds great. Now that's a really, really important part of EQing, and we're actually going to get to that in a little bit. But I am going to guess if you're doing home recording, you don't have an extremely fancy board that allows you to do pre-tape EQ like all of these multi-million-dollar studios from the 60s and 70s and 80s. So you are basically going to need to fake it. You're going to need to go in, create your own pre-tape EQ, make the tones as best you can, and then once you get to the mixing stage, mess it up. Just go ahead and get your hands dirty and totally mess up the work that you've done. So I'm okay with doing this, telling you to do this in solo. None of the rest of this is going to be in solo. Every other step is in context of the mix. This is the last time that you should be EQing in solo. So let's go through, and we're just going to solo each instrument out. We're going to listen to the problems, and we are going to try to balance the tone to get it to sound the best we can. So I'm going to start, let's just start with this guitar, since we were just using that. And I'm actually going to bring up what I've already done, because I want us to get to a place where the mix sounds similar at the end. And I'm actually going to change this. I actually liked this better. So I'm going to change this a little bit. 416. And I'm going to turn this down by 12. Great. I'm just going to turn this off. So let's look at what I've done here. Well, actually, first, let's listen to what I've done. So here's before. And here's after. So now obviously this helps a lot, but a lot warmer, which you can see it's because I boosted the low mids a little bit. It's got some more bite to it, which you can see because I boosted that top end a little bit. And it has a high pass filter, which we will talk about in just a moment. But let's, it actually looks like someone has a question based around that. So Fresh Meat asks, should all instruments except kick and bass be high pass filtered? So this is just a hair off subject, but it was something that we were going to talk about in a little bit. A lot of engineers disagree on this. I think the answer is yes. Some people think the answer is no. I do think a lot of people use high pass filters too aggressively. So the reason that you hear people talk about like, oh, slap a high pass filter on everything except for the kick and the bass. I actually slap a high pass filter on the kick and the bass too. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The reason that everyone does that is A, to make space for your low end instruments, which is usually the kick and the bass, and B, to cut out any sounds from the room that just live down in that area and aren't really heard, but take up headroom. So they make the sound louder, like the computer physically thinks that this sound is louder than it actually is. And we're trying to get rid of all that. Plus, whenever you have tons and tons of low-end information that you can't hear, and every track has it, and it all gets stacked on top of itself, by the end of the mix, stuff sounds really muddy. So you just want to get rid of that. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm just going to turn off these things. And I'm going to turn this off. So, there we go. You see all this stuff that's happening down here? I can't hear any of that. In fact, I'm going to create a low pass filter. Let's make it really harsh. And I want you to use your ears and listen to see if you can really hear much down there at all. Now, this is all below what's called the fundamental frequency of the instrument. So the fundamental frequency is basically the lowest note that you're playing. It's if you're playing an E string on an electric guitar, it is that E. So everything below that is either just kind of some subtle tone stuff, or it's like room noise. It's the air conditioner. It's the traffic from the street, from across the street. It's your dog barking coming in through the sound of the walls. It's the hum that's coming through your guitar amp, stuff like that. So let me show you what this is going to sound like. Now that's all happening. Can you hear anything? You can maybe hear just kind of some like doo 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 doo, just barely. Hold on, let me delete that. Ah, shoot. Spinning beach ball of death. So you can't even really hear that when you cut it. So it's not taking out any of the tone. Let me delete this very silly sounding thing. Okay. Well, while my computer is figuring this out, it's not getting rid of any of the tone. It's just creating some headspace. It's just getting rid of stuff that is going to clutter the mix when everything is added on top of each other. Now, what a lot of people do, and this is why you hear a lot of people online say like, oh, don't high pass everything, it's just going to hurt your mix, is they will high pass quite a bit. Like they'll high pass even past the fundamental frequency. And sometimes that's great. But when you're doing that, you are doing shaping to help all of the instruments fit together. And you want to do that strategically. You want to do that to one instrument because you want another instrument to fit better in the mix. If you do that on every instrument, all that's going to happen is your mix is going to sound really thin. Your bass and your kick are going to sound awesome, but everything else is going to sound really, really bad. So my computer is again having some issues. I'm going to save this and restart Logic. I'll keep on talking while I'm doing that. So the best way to know where to set your high pass filter is basically to turn on your high pass filter and slowly sweep it up until you start to hear some of the tone get lost. Then back it up. You don't want to take any of the tone out. You can do that later if you want to, but this is only to clean up the stuff that you can't hear, but the energy is there. That's all you're doing. So take it until you can hear the tone going away and then back it up a little bit. So let me bring this back up. Ah, shoot. Well. I think this was here. I think it was like 1417, something like that. Okay, great. So we know why we've done this. Oh, and let me actually, well, no, we'll talk about using high pass filters on the low end instruments once we get there, because I do actually do that. Let's talk about these two things. So I'm going to disable them, and we're going to listen to this without them. So to me, this guitar sounds kind of thin. This guitar sounds, it sounds thin. It sounds distant. It doesn't really sound all that aggressive, but it's the only guitar that's happening during this section. It is the only chordal instrument, nothing else. It is bass and drums and a singer and guitar. So this needs to be a lot more aggressive. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add some aggression up here. And I'm going to add a little bit of warmth down here. I just realized you guys cannot see what I'm talking about. I have this on the wrong monitor. Hopefully now you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So, this is what I was talking about down here. This is the lows, low mids that I'm going to be boosting. I'm going to be boosting a little bit of the upper mids as well. So just a hair. It's subtle, doesn't need to be anything more than subtle. Although sometimes if the instrument sounds really bad, then you might want to be more than subtle. But I've really helped it out a little bit. Like I've added a little bit of presence, added a little bit of warmth. Now here is one very important thing, and it's something that no one talks about. And if you take nothing away from this live stream, take this away, please. No one gain stages their EQs. Please start gain staging your EQs. It will change everything about how you EQ and how your EQs sound, and whether you know that you actually helped or hurt your sound with your EQ. Here's what I'm talking about. So right now, let me go to my mixer. Actually, hold on one moment. Here we go. So on my master bus, I have a VU meter. VU meters are basically the old way of telling volume. So if you ever, if you close your eyes, in your mind's eye, you're thinking about a mixing board from a really nice studio, and you look at the top of the mixing board and you see all those dials. These are the dials you're seeing. Now, VU meters do not measure volume like full-scale meters do. And full-scale meters are what DAWs use. So right here, if I hit play, see this right here? That is a full-scale meter. Now, you can forget this jargon immediately. It doesn't matter. But basically, your DAW uses a digitally accurate process to tell you what the volume of an instrument is. It is extremely accurate. You're going to be able to be like, great, this is peaking around negative 14.5 decibels full scale. The problem is this. This is an accurate way of telling volume. It is not an accurate way of telling loudness. And there is a difference. I'm going to get on my soapbox. All right, let's do it. Soapbox time. Volume, loudness, not the same thing. Big mixing moment for you if you're just realizing this. So volume is basically the literal sound wave energy. It is a mathematical way of telling how much sound wave energy there is. It is not a way of saying this is how loud something is. Loudness is basically how you, a human, perceives volume to your own ears. So humans do not hear sound as accurately as computers do. Computers, obviously, it's exactly accurate. we hear sound more in averages. So rather than every single millisecond, us having the exactly correct amount of interpretation of a sound, we hear more just the general average of a sound. So if let's say there's a kick drum, and like it's electronic kick drum, and it's just going like do 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 something like that. Now the peak meter, excuse me, the full scale meter, the meter that's on your computer is going to just be going crazy, just because what's happening in the real world is a ton of volume is happening, and then a ton of volume is going away, and a ton of volume is happening, and then a ton of volume is going away. Now, what your ears are hearing, rather than it just being like up and up, up and down, up and down, up and down, is it's more kind of like, it's a much lower bob because it's happening so fast and it's all happening at the same kind of general level, and we're hearing it in averages. So to us, it's kind of more like, oh yeah, this sounds like it's around this area. You know, the range of volume is a lot smaller in the way that we would hear that sound. And I swear, I'm getting to a point here. This is not random. So all this being said, VU meters are actually less accurate to volume, but more accurate to loudness. So they're less accurate in telling what is the exact volume millisecond to millisecond of a particular instrument, but they're more accurate at saying, hey, this is probably what your ears are hearing this instrument as. So if, a full scale meter would be like just going crazy all over this, a VU meter might just be sort of just sitting around this area, because to our ears, it's just kind of the same volume. So that being said, I care way more whenever I'm gain staging about something being at the same level on a VU meter than I do at something being the same level on a full scale meter. Because I want it to sound as loud as it did before, not just for it to be at the same volume. So if you're doing any kind of gain staging, I could not recommend using VU meters more, because you are actually going to be getting an accurate sound as far as loudness goes. So in relation to EQ, we'll bring this back home. So right now I've cut a little bit, cut a lot, and I've boosted a lot. So I could just say, oh, we're good. It's the same level probably. I cut a lot, I boosted a lot. Like, it's probably the same volume. But more than likely that's not the case. So let me do a before and after. So this is before. This is no EQ on this. And let me actually really quickly take a moment. It looks like, yeah. Let me take a moment to turn all this stuff off. Whenever my computer is shutting down, it's turning everything back on. Here we go. So, here's before. Okay, so kind of living around 10 dBs VU. And then here's after. See how it's louder? It's living around 7 dBs VU right now. Now, with your VU meter, which by the way, you can get these free, just like search free VU meter and you'll find one, and they work fine. Just make sure that you're putting it on your stereo output because then you can use this for everything. One nice thing is that you can usually control the headroom, which is almost just like using a magnifying glass. So I'm just going to say, I want this to be based on a different headroom. This is all tech speak. It doesn't matter. All this is going to do is increase the resolution. So I'll be able to tell a little bit more obviously, what the loudness is. So here's before. Okay, so kind of 3 to 2, somewhere in there. Here's after. So more like 1 to 0. Okay, so that means I have turned the loudness of this track up by about 2 decibels. So I want to compensate. I want to go to my output and I want to turn this down by about 2 decibels. Hit play again, and we want it to sit in the same level. Okay, it's kind of around the same area. Cool. And this isn't a perfect science. You don't have to get it to where it's, a carbon copy of exactly what it was before. You just kind of want to get it to that area. So let's see what this sounds like. So here's before. Here's after. Now, that is the same loudness to our ears. And you can really hear, like, man, it does sound warmer. It does sound a little bit more aggressive. Now, one really important thing about the concept of gain staging when it comes to EQ is this. And I'm actually going to use Logic Pro's EQ to demonstrate this, because they do a great job of showing this graphically. So let's just say, okay, I'm going to boost here, and I'm going to boost here. It doesn't really matter. This is just for demonstrations purposes. So, cool. Now, obviously, I just boosted a lot, so I'm going to need to do some cutting. Now, look at what happens when I turn down the volume of this EQ. You see how with Logic's, it actually is showing you graphically, oh, I'm just going to use the EQ and I'm going to turn down all of the frequency spectrum. So what that essentially does is that's saying, hey, I just want a little bit of a boost here, a little bit of a boost here, and I want you to turn everything else down. So even though I only boosted, in reality, if I make sure that it's at the same loudness, I actually made some cuts as well. I cut everything that I didn't boost. And vice versa. Let me put this back over here. If I was to cut these areas and I boosted this so that it was at the same loudness, well, now the exact opposite happened. I just boosted everything that I didn't cut. This is part of the reason why people talk all the time about why cutting is usually preferable to boosting. It's because whenever you do your gain staging, you're basically boosting anyway. So it's better to cut the bad stuff out and then just gain stage it so that you're boosting all the good stuff, rather than going and boosting the good stuff even more and cutting other stuff that might not actually be that bad, but now you're cutting it. And you're cutting it at the same level that you might be cutting something that is fine, that you don't actually want to cut. So that's why gain staging with EQ so important. People do it all the time with compression. They do not do it with EQ. Again, if you could take away one thing from this: gain stage with EQs, use a VU meter. Could not recommend that enough. Great. Just going to say this again, because we're going to be moving on here in a second. If anyone is confused, if anyone needs me to go over anything again, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to pause, make sure that we're all in the same boat. So I'm not going to go and do every single instrument because that's just going to take a long time. Y'all don't need to see me just mix this whole thing. But you can see, if I go through, you'll be able to see kind of what I've done. So for instance, on the overheads, for my tonal shaping, you can see I did a lot more cutting and I did a little bit of boost in the top end. So this obviously was way too aggressive in the upper mids, maybe a little bit too much energy here in the mids, and I wanted a pretty large cutoff there. You can also see that I've used a few times some analog EQs. So this is, if you have analog EQs, either you have them in, as a premium plugin, or your DAW has them. The tone shaping step, the enhancing your track step, is the best place to use any of your analog EQs, because this is essentially the step where you're getting these instruments to sound the best they can before you go and you do all of your mixing. So these things are going to add some great color. You don't have to use them, but this is the step to use them on if that's something that you're going to want to do. Fresh Meat asks a question. I don't have Waves plugins. Not sure how I can get this VU meter with stock plugins. So like I said earlier, there are definitely free versions of VU meters out there. Just do a quick Google search on free VU meter plugin and something will pop up. For a very long time, I used free VU meter plugins. They work fine. I only use the Waves one because I think I actually got it free as a bonus during some sale a year or two ago. Yes, MV. So Michael Jones talked about MV Meter 2. That is the one that I used for a long time. It's free. Just go and grab that. If you're going to use MV Meter 2, make sure that you have it set to VU mode. I didn't do that for a while because it's always on the user interface of a VU meter, but sometimes it's set to full scale mode, just like your actual DAW volume meters are, and obviously that's not going to be helpful to you at all. So just make sure that you've got the correct version. But yeah, so like I said, if you're going to use any analog EQs, this is the step to use them on. So I went through and did all of my enhancement already. So let's do a quick before and after for this. I believe it's my first two. Okay, so here's before. Okay, and here's after.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're ringing. We spent together.
So everything sounds a lot better now. A lot of instruments are a lot clearer. There's a lot more top end. There's a lot more bass. There's less muddiness in the low mids. That said, these instruments are not fitting together very well. And we're going to get to that in a little bit, but it's important to remember, this is just preparing your mix. I haven't gotten in and done any EQing in context yet. This is something that I do before I even start the mix, just because I want to make sure that I'm starting with the best tracks that I can. So we are going to move on to the next step, and that is step 3, which is to balance the tone of your mix, or step 3, which is to paint the canvas. So let's go back to the painter method. Let's go back to this metaphor that we're using. We're on the side of this hill. We have prepared our canvas. We have prepared our paints. We've gone and sketched out each object specifically. We've made sure that everything's accurate. Now it's time to start painting. Let's actually put some paint on the canvas. So this is where we're going to get primarily most of our colors. This isn't going to help us create any kind of definition. This isn't going to help us create any kind of space or shading or step or I forgot the last word I was going to say. It's not going to help us to actually have any of these tracks fit together or any of the objects that you're painting to fit together. Everything's still going to look very two-dimensional, but the colors are all going to be right for the first time. So what that means is that we are going to be using a mix bus EQ. So mix bus EQ is very simple, but it's also very complicated depending on, let me get rid of this, depending on what you want to use it for. So a mix bus EQ is basically just an EQ that you put on your stereo output of your DAW. Simple as that. Yeah, it's literally as simple as that. Now, obviously, I have some kind of different routing set up. So I have this set up on a bus, and then that bus is going to the output of my DAW. That's just a personal way I've done that because I don't want my mix bus EQ to affect my reference tracks, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. So I actually, great way of doing this is to have everything go to a single bus and then send the bus to your stereo output so that your reference tracks are completely separate from any processing you do on the bus. Anyway, so right now is the time when I'm going to start listening to my reference tracks. Now, for anyone who is unaware of what reference tracks are, let me go over here. Reference tracks are one of the best ways that you can get a professional translatable mix. I actually was not a fan of reference tracks for a long time because in my head I was like, oh, it makes you less creative. Like I want to do my own thing. And what kept happening is like I'd make this really great, cool sounding mix that would sound really good in my speakers, and then I would go to the car, and God, it would sound so awful in my car. It would just sound terrible. And I'm sure you guys have all had this experience where you've worked hours and hours on a mix and you love it and it's perfect, and you go and you take it to your friend's house and you play it through your friend's speakers and it just sounds like absolute crap, and it's so disheartening. Using reference tracks is going to help that. It's going to make your mixes more translatable. So what a reference track is it's basically a professionally mixed song that is the same genre as the song you're mixing. It's kind of the same vibe as the song you're mixing. It's got similar instrumentation. It's basically like if you're playing darts, it's the center of the target that you're wanting to throw your dart at to hit. Now, that doesn't mean that you're wanting to creatively make your mix sound exactly like the reference. It's more that from a scientific perspective, from a utility perspective, you're wanting to just kind of get the overall tone of the song, tone of your mix, to match the tone of your reference track. Or like you want kind of the general volume balance of your mix to match the volume balance of the reference track. You want the general dynamics of your mix to match the dynamics of your reference track. And the reason for this is that these mixes have been done with translatability in mind. If a label needs to get a song professionally, or rather, if a label needs to get a song out onto the radio, then they're going to make sure that they're sending it to a mixer who knows, oh, this has to sound good this has to sound good in every car. This has to sound good in every set of earphones. This has to sound good in every speaker system. So they're going to make it completely translatable. Now, if I was to use that mix as my target, well, that's half the work done for me. And I can do all of my own creative decisions on my own. That's not saying at all that you don't want to be creative with it, but this is going to be fantastic, especially for like the first 50% of my mix, as I'm doing a lot of my more scientific, more utility work. I'm not making creative mix decisions necessarily. I'm just trying to get everything to fit. I'm just trying to make it sound good before I go off and do all the cool stuff. So this is the song that I'm using for this particular mix. This is actually the song that the band wanted me to use as my target. It's a lot cleaner. It's professionally recorded, professionally mixed, not recorded in a living room. But it's a great target to have. And again, the point is not to hit the target exactly, it's just to get in the area. So let's listen to this. Let me back this up a little bit. Cool. Well, now if I listen to my mix, turn this off, I'm going to hear a pretty significant difference.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus.
A lot of low mids. It's a lot darker. Too much bass, you could say. Just generally, the overall balance of tone in my mix, excuse me, coffee burps. The overall balance of tone in my mix is, to put it simply, like it is out of balance. If the target is the reference track, my mix is out of balance. So what I'm going to want to do is get my mix to generally be in balance. This is where your mix bus EQ comes into play. So it looks like there's a question from Sharon. Are there things to consider about reference tracks having been mastered? I'm so glad you brought that up. So before we get onto this, Sharon's a little bit ahead of me, but we'll talk about that now. So reference tracks have been mastered. That obviously means they're a lot louder. And again, I don't mean their volume is higher. It is. But I don't mean that. I mean that we psychoacoustically perceive them to be louder. Now, why that is the case, that's a whole other conversation on how to do mastering. It's not worth going into that right now. But we are not going to be able to match our loudness to their loudness very easily. So one thing that I like to do is I actually like to put on a limiter onto my mix bus. And I only do this is important, I only do this while I'm comparing it to the reference. Because one of the main reasons that the reference is so loud is because the mix has been limited. I take that off very quickly. I'm not going to mix through a limiter. That's not a good idea. Because you're really going to struggle to figure out your dynamic balance if you do it that way. And plus, limiters are meant for mastering. You just really don't do that. But I'm going to go in here. I'm going to select the limiter. Okay. And I am going to try to match my loudness to the loudness of this reference. Now that's not going to be easy because I don't know how much gain reduction of limiting they're doing on this, but I can get sort of a general idea. So let's listen to this. And actually, first off, I like to set both of my songs at about 0 dB VU, just to make it easy. Cool. You can see I've actually already done this with this plugin. I've already turned it down by about 4.5 decibels. So let me try to hit that same amount here. Now you can see I don't actually have any output on this limiter. I really wish I did. So I'm going to have to use my own output. Turn that off. Okay, so we're trying to get this to sit kind of between 2 and 0 dBVU. We'll turn that off.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're...
Okay, so obviously it's pretty loud as it is. I am going to just take the out ceiling down then instead of, or rather I'm going to take the, I'm going to do both. There we go.
We spent together.
Come on. Oh, right, I got to click on it.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're ringing. We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you.
Okay, so that's obviously too loud, so I'm going to take it down a little bit.
Together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you.
Okay, So I'm getting probably 2 to 4 decibels of limiting, which is probably roughly what this song had. This limiting is not going to sound good. That's okay. It's quick and dirty. It's not supposed to be. Again, we're not mixing through it. It's not going to go on our mix. It's just so that we can reference more accurately our reference track. So let's do a before and after. So here is the reference track. Okay, and here's our mix.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're ringing.
So it obviously sounds a lot quieter. Now, part of the reason for that is it's a lot darker, and usually limiters tend to grab bass frequencies a lot more aggressively, and we have a lot of bass, as you can hear. But also it's because, the other mix has been fully compressed, fully EQ'd. It's had a lot done to the mix itself to increase the loudness of the mix before it ever got to limiting. So this is not a perfect science in any way. You're just kind of trying to get it close to where to your ears it's fairly similar. So now that that's been done, let's go back and check out our mix bus EQ. So usually, let me make this smaller. There we go. So usually, I would recommend not doing more than 3 decibels of anything on your mix bus EQ. I don't think I did here. Yeah, I didn't. So the most I did was 3 decibels. I would even recommend not doing more than 1 to 2 if you can avoid it, but this particular mix needed something a little bit more dramatic. And I'll talk about this in just a moment, why I have a high pass filter on here. So let's do a before and after. So I'm going to turn this off since I'm not listening to the reference. So here's before.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's
And here's after.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you.
So it definitely helps a lot. It's also kind of harsh. We're going to be dealing with that in future steps, but I'll do another before and after. I'll just go back and forth so you can hear.
We spent together,
So before,
they've left me with tinnitus,
all of a
and it's
sudden, just
quiet now without you,
tons
but
of
you're ringing.
high end gone. It's a lot muddier.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus,
Drums really pop out
and it's
here.
quiet now without you, but you're ringing.
Now let's compare that to the reference. And I'll turn my limiter on because I'm comparing it to the reference.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but
Okay, now let's listen to the reference. Okay, and I'm going to turn this off and we'll hear how far away we were.
we spent together, they've left me
Turn it back
with
on and you'll hear that we're a lot
tinnitus, and it's
closer.
quiet now without you, but you're ringing. We spent together.
So that's introduced some harshness that, like I said, we're going to be dealing with on track-by-track basis. We'll deal with that in a little bit. But it's definitely helped. It's shaped the color of our entire mix, the tone of our entire mix. It's helped out a lot. So as far as how I did each of these, I'll tell you. First off, I have this high-pass filter on here because this is filtering out the subs, the sub bass area. And this particular mix really doesn't need anything in the sub bass. If you're doing dance music, if you're doing electronic music, you're doing pop music, if you're doing music with a lot of thump and something that really gets you moving, then you're going to need a lot more sub bass frequencies. But this particular mix, indie rock, it's not going to need anything down there because anything in the sub bass area is usually felt. It's not heard. Like if you remember whenever I took a low pass filter and I swept all the way down to where all you could hear was just like the room noise at the bottom of the guitar. couldn't hear anything. You could kind of feel it a little bit, especially if I turned the volume up, but you couldn't really hear it. So the reason I take this stuff out is it is soaking up headroom. So it's making the computer think, oh, this has more volume, but it's not actually adding any loudness. And if we want a loud mix, we want to have as much headroom with our volume as possible so that we can do more limiting in the mastering stage. We can do more compression in the mastering stage. We are wanting to deal with that. So that's why I have that on here. I'm not going to do that on every mix. I just wanted to do it on this mix. So I cut a lot out of the lower mids, as you can see. Now, the main way that I've done this, honestly, is just me sweeping around, listening to my reference first, and then sweeping around and kind of saying, okay, this sounds like a particularly bad area in comparison to what I heard on the reference. So let me turn this off for now. So I'll listen to the reference again. And then I'll listen to mine.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now.
So usually when I do this, I've got kind of a wider cue. I also sort of have to turn my limiter off at this point, especially if I'm doing anything sweeping in this area, because like I said before, usually low mid frequencies just cause limiters to freak out. So you'll hear how distorted this is right now.
We spent together, they've left me with
really dramatic. So I'm just going to turn this stuff off for now.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're ringing.
Yeah, so to me,
We spent together, they've left me with
that's pretty problematic. And I also heard kind of some problematic frequencies over here.
We spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now
Kind
without
of some boxiness. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa.
We spent together, they've left me.
Okay, so that's how I got that. Hold on. Let me do this. There we go. Now let's talk about how I got this. So I have a very wide cue on here. That's something important to remember. Whenever you're doing mix bus EQ, you're not fixing resonances. You're not doing any tiny cuts or boosts. Every boost and cut you do needs to be a much wider cue, either super wide like this one or kind of wide like this one. Like this one's a cue of 2. These are all kind of around cues of 1 to 2. So somewhere between 0 and 2 is where I would stay. I wouldn't go any thinner than that. So let me turn these off.
We spent together, they've left me.
So this, obviously, the whole mix just started to sound a little bit duller. So I wanted just more of a general upper mids and high boost.
We spent together, they've left me with.
So that helped that out a little bit. And then I just wanted a little bit of boost in the upper mids to give it some aggression. It just feels kind of weak. It doesn't feel very present. And usually mixes that are very present, that feel very close to the listener, tend to have a lot more energy in the upper mids, which is part of the reason why, the other mix feels a lot closer to you and this one doesn't.
We spent together, they've left me with.
Now that does add some harshness, especially in the cymbals and a little bit in the vocals. So in the next few steps we'll start to deal with that. So that's all you got to do. It's a lot of just using your ears, listening to your reference, listening to your mix, really sitting there and thinking like, okay, where are the broad problems? Like my mix is too muddy, my mix is too dull. Okay, well, muddy is usually around the low mids. I should probably cut somewhere in the low mids. Dull usually means there's not enough upper mids or highs. So I need a boost somewhere in the upper mids or highs. That's all I did. And then I swept around to kind of find the area that I thought could use it the most. Now, before we move on, very important point. We need to do our gain staging. So, let's look at what this is like on our VU meter before.
Night we spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now.
So kind of 2 to 0. Now let's see what it's like after.
Night we spent together, they've left me with tinnitus.
Okay, so kind of more like 4 to 2. Now that makes sense. I know there's a lot of boosts, but we took a lot out of the lower mids. We took a lot out of the subs. And like I said before, for whatever reason, VU meters, limiters, a lot of loudness specific technology tends to register the lows, the sub bass, the low mids a lot more than the top part. So that took a lot out of our overall loudness. So we need to compensate. I'm going to turn it up by about 2. We'll see if it goes back up.
Night we spent together,
Yep. And
they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're ringing.
So now I can be confident that the moves that I've made are accurate. That like when I'm hearing my EQ, that I'm not hearing, oh, it sounds better because I made it louder, or I'm not saying, oh, it sounds worse because I made it quieter, because the human ear does that. For whatever reason, the human ear perceives louder sounds as better, quieter sounds as worse. So I'm feeling very good on that. One important thing, if you are doing this, I would recommend on your mix bus EQ, I would recommend using a linear phase EQ or a natural phase EQ. It's not worth me going into why that is or what the difference is. But basically your regular EQ is not linear phase. It does cause some phasing problems, which means anytime you put an EQ on, it does change the tone of the sound a little bit just by being on. Whereas linear phase EQs don't change the tone really at all. And natural phase EQs only change it a little bit. Now, the trade-off being they add a lot of latency to your DAW, so you don't want to use tons of them. One is fine. I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but it's not worth getting into the science behind all of it. All you need to know is if you're doing your mix bus EQ, I'd recommend doing linear phase or natural phase. It's the only time you really ever got to do that. We're going to move on to the next step here in a moment. I've got a few questions to answer, and we're also going to take just a 5-10 minute break if everyone to go use the restroom before we move on. So Freshme asks, are you listening only on headphones, or are you switching to studio monitors as well? So this is really important to me because I have crappy speakers and I have decent studio headphones. So for the purposes of this mix, I did everything in headphones because all of you are only going to be hearing this on headphones, most likely. And I can't do this live mix using speakers because it'll get caught in my microphone. There'll be a bunch of... It's a whole thing. You can do all of your mixing in headphones if you want. If you have really good headphones, I'd especially recommend having open back headphones if you're going to do any kind of mixing rather than closed back. Closed back are usually used for recording, not mixing, and they're less accurate. So it is possible. Best situation is to use both your headphones and your speakers for mixing. I usually like to say your headphones are like a magnifying glass. Like you can hear details a lot easier, but it's kind of easy to lose track of the overall picture of the sound, lose track of what something actually sounds like because you're listening to the details. So I tend to use headphones a lot more towards the end of a mix than I do towards the beginning. And I tend to use speakers more at the beginning of a mix and a little bit less towards the end. I reference a lot more using headphones towards the end. So if you have really crappy speakers and good headphones, I'd recommend using headphones only. If you have really good speakers and crappy headphones, I recommend using only your speakers and a treated room. That's important. If you've got good speakers and good headphones, use both. So, and then Mykola, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I hope I am. asks, "Hey Dylan, will this session be available on the Musician on a Mission website?" I believe it will be available on the members area of the website. I'm not sure. I would, if there's any question on that, I would email support@musicianonamission.com. Again, that's support@musicianonamission.com. And no matter what, no matter whether or not it gets onto the website, they will send you a copy. I'm recording this right now. They'll make sure to send it to you so you can have it. So we are we're gonna make that happen. I'm not in charge of that. Is the only reason why I'm saying I'm not totally sure. I don't want to give you a yes if the answer is a no, or a no if the answer is a yes. But no matter what, if you do email support, they'll make sure to get you a copy. So that will be good. I also would love it. We might be sending out, I believe we're sending out a survey after this. I'm considering turning this concept into a more in-depth course. So if you could answer the survey we're going to send out, or send any thoughts that you have on stuff you liked, maybe improvements that you would recommend to that support email, that would be great as well. So yeah, we are going to take a, let's just say a 10-minute break. Everyone go pee. Everyone go eat your food, do whatever. And we'll be back. I am going to probably speed through the rest of this a little bit more so that we can wrap this up. And we will go from there. All right. I will see all of you very soon. Okay, everyone, we are back and ready for action. Excuse me. I'm gonna wait, just another minute or two, just to let everyone file back in from their bathroom breaks or getting food or anything like that. Um, if anyone has any questions in the meantime, slip those into the comment section and let's address them. Okay, yeah, I'd say it's probably time for us to get started again. Let's roll into it. Um, so yeah, fresh meat. I'm definitely with you. Nice cold drink and some chocolate to eat, and that's the pretty much the most important thing to have while mixing. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm doing water because I'm talking for a living right now, but sometimes it might be a little bit loud. Might be a little bit more alcoholic from time to time. And that chocolate sounds really good, honestly. Um, John saying, please comment on my observation above about room noise. So it looks like John made a comment. I did an experiment on this and recorded just my room, breathing and electrical stuff, and finished up with noticeable sound in the 60 to 150 region, which I now try to cut on all tracks. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's a question or if that's just saying a thing that you do. I don't know if I could recommend cutting all the way up to 150 if you're cutting any of the fundamental. Um, if it's like a female singer and like their fundamental, the lowest note they sing is at like 300 hertz, go for it. Doesn't matter. But if it's like a bass guitar and you're cutting, you know, all the way up into the bass region, or even just a regular guitar, like you're kind of cutting out a lot of the low strings. So I would tailor it to your instrument. I wouldn't just cut that out no matter what. Because I am okay with noise. I'm okay with leaving noise in if it means that I get to leave more of the instrument itself in. That's more important to me than getting rid of noise. So, good stuff. Oh, it's so yeah. John's saying it supported your point. Yes, from back in the day, you definitely have a lot of back in the day. Back an hour ago, you definitely have a lot of junk happening down there. Um, Great. So we're gonna move on. So right now we have done steps 1 through 3. There's 5 steps. So step 1, just a review. That is preparing our tools or cleaning our tracks. Step 2 is enhancing our instruments or sketching each object to make sure we know exactly what the shape of every object is. Step 3, throwing color on the canvas, getting all the color right, or doing our mix bus EQ. So now we are on to step 4. And step 4 is the one that is good. You're going to get out of your comfort zone a little bit on this, in my opinion. Step 4 is creating space for your instruments to live in, or step 4 is creating depth with shading. So to get back onto the painter method, next step in the process of painting is taking it from a 2-dimensional painting to a 3-dimensional painting. Obviously, this country church right next to us is a lot closer to the viewer than the village that's down in the valley, which is like a mile away. Now, before we've added any shadows into the painting, we have basically tricked the eye into thinking, okay, everything is two-dimensional, nothing has any substance, and these tiny dots of houses are at the exact same place as this massive church building, even though one's to the left and one's to the right, because that's all we can tell. If it's two-dimensional, one's to the left, one's to the right. So if you're painting, the way that you are able to show depth and to basically create a foreground and a background is by adding shading. It's adding your shadows, basically. You cannot have a realistic painting if it doesn't have shadows, almost 100% of the time. So the same is true for EQing. Now, here's one important point I'm going to bring up. When I'm talking about creating space for your instruments, I mean in the frequency spectrum. I don't mean in terms of reverb or delay. So usually, whenever we talk about creating space in a mix, we're referring to reverb or delay or volume even, because the ear perceives louder sounds to be closer. So, we're saying, if I want to create, if I want to move something to the background, I want more reverb on it. Or if I want to move something to the foreground, I want less reverb on it, or I want it to be louder or whatever. That's not really what we're talking about here. What I'm talking about is giving everything space in the frequency spectrum to live in, so that no instruments are slap fighting each other, trying to sit in the exact same area and vie for your attention. And here's why this is important. There is a concept in mixing and in acoustical physics known as masking. And what masking is basically the acoustical phenomenon where when two sounds that live in kind of similar areas of the frequency spectrum are played at the same time, rather than those sounds being twice as loud, those sounds are only 50% louder. Now, that might just be math to you. It's like, whatever. It's not twice as loud. It's only a little bit louder. What's the big deal? Well, what that means is that they are covering up each other's volume. Like, we cannot hear the full sound of that instrument. So, for instance, let's say there's two instruments and they both have a lot of energy in the low mids of the frequency spectrum. Well, they're both going to fight for space. They're going to fight for dominance, basically. They're going to fight for your attention. And if you're listening to them both at the same time, it will be kind of difficult to actually hear the warmth of those instruments. It'll be hard to hear the depth of those instruments. Both instruments will actually sound thinner than they actually are. A great way to test this, and I would recommend this to anyone. I could actually just do it now, honestly, now that I'm thinking about it. Great way to test this is to solo two different instruments, or rather solo one instrument and listen to it. And then solo another instrument that's close to it in the frequency spectrum and listen to the tone of that first instrument with them both playing, and listen to like how much that tone changed all of a sudden. It's like, man, I didn't turn that instrument down at all, and yet all of a sudden it just sounds really different. Let me see if I can find a good example of this. This mix may or may not be the best way to teach you this, but let me try this out. Okay. So I'm also going to make all of this mono just to make it easier to understand the point. So here's one guitar, and I'm going to just make them both the same volume. Okay, here's the next guitar. Okay, now I will say this one is a lot more aggressive in the top end. I'm actually going to cut some of this out to make them, to force them to sit in the same area. Yeah, this is just for a moment for demonstration. So let's try this. Okay, then let's just solo this next one out. Hear how all of a sudden all you can hear is the upper mids? It's like all the warmth is just gone. Because it's fighting for air, it's fighting for space. Let's do it again. So, pretty good amount of warmth. And also it's gone. And you can do it with the other one too. So listen to this. And solo this out. A lot of the low mids are just gone, and a lot of the higher, the upper mids are gone as well. You start to lose those. This is one of the reasons why people talk about the fact that doing your EQs in solo is so dangerous, because masking exists. And if I do a bunch of EQ moves in solo and I'm like, oh my god, it's so warm, it's so bright, it's so punchy, I love it. And then I play it in terms of the rest of the mix, and all of a sudden it's all gone. That's because I just boosted in a bunch of places where other instruments live. So it's now fighting for space. It's fighting for air. So I can't hear it nearly as well as I can in the places that I might not have boosted. Very, very important concept. So what we're going to do is basically do an EQ concept known as range allocation to help to encourage different instruments to sit in their own, like to live in their own part section of the frequency spectrum and play nicely with each other. Now, this is something that Rob talks about a lot, range allocation. I actually have a bit of a more aggressive spin on it than he does, so you are going to learn something new here if it's something that you have learned about in the past. So, we're going to go back here. So, right now, you can actually see, hold on one moment. Other than this, let me move this up. So you can see how I have just a line of EQs right here. Everything right here. Now, what these are, every one of these is a range allocation EQ. This is, I'm gonna put a quick disclaimer. This is not something that has to be done on every mix. And in fact, this isn't something that I do on most of my mixes, because I'm a professional. Like, I know how to do this concept, how to pepper this basically into the mixes I do without having to go and like sit down and have a step. That said, I could not recommend having this as a step more, because I think it's really, really helpful in creating space. Now, this is going to be a subtle change, but it is going to be very helpful. So let me show you what I am doing. Let me go here. This isn't the best example. Let me find a better example. Okay, yeah, here's a good example. Okay, so let me actually delete all of this extra junk that I have here because it's just going to get confusing. Okay, great. So let's talk about what we are seeing here. Right now, there are 4 different boosts and cuts. There is a shelf at the top. This is on the base, by the way. There's a shelf at the top. There is a shelf at the bottom. There's a cut up here in the mids. And there's a boost up here in the mids. And there's a cut down here in the low mids. Now, what I'm basically doing is each of these is in its own way saying, hey, bass, I want you to be emphasized in this one particular part of the frequency spectrum, and I want you to get out of the way of the rest. We are creating space for the bass to live in. It's almost like if there's a row of chairs, I am saying, bass, you're going to go sit in that chair, rather than trying to lay out across like 5 different chairs. Now, on a different instrument, let me grab this one. Not the best example with the bass. Let me find a good example to go with the bass. Okay, sure. So here's a good example with the kick. I didn't do the exact same because usually I would recommend using shelves. So the opposite of this, I actually have a shelf boost here. This is the bass, the low end, and the sub bass. And I've got a large shelf cutting everything else, and then I've got an extra large filter right here cutting the top end. Now, and then I have this, hold on, let me get rid of this. This right here is just to cut some of the noise out. This is just for me. This has nothing to do with the range allocation system. So this is basically me saying, okay, kick drum, I want you to sit in the chair down at the end, and I want you to get out of the way of all of this other stuff. Now, this might seem very aggressive. The cool thing about it is that whenever I'm going to turn all of these on, and you'll see what it sounds like, is it's not actually going to change the tone very much. And part of that is, to be a broken record, I've done a really good job of doing gain staging, so everything is the same loudness for the most part. I'm not doing particularly aggressive boosts and cuts, so I'm only boosting 2 decibels, I'm only cutting 2 decibels. This is definitely aggressive, but, over here this isn't aggressive. And because I'm doing this on all of them, it's basically helping to push everything into one area and not have it lay out over the entire frequency spectrum. Another way to look at this is actually a way I really like to look at it, is looking at this almost like puzzle piece EQ. So if you think of 2 puzzle pieces, one might have 2 holes in it and 1 thing sticking out. The other one might have 2 things sticking out and 1 hole, and they fit together really nicely. But if they were just 2 squares, I couldn't fit them together really at all. Or if they both had 2 holes and 1 thing sticking out, they wouldn't fit together either. So let me show you what this sounds like, and then we'll go into why I picked what I picked. Okay, so I'm going to turn all these on. So here is before. I turned all this stuff up. I forgot. Bummer. I don't know where I had it. Hold on one moment. Close enough. So let me grab this so you can hear. So let me turn everything on for this step. And you'll hear how everything, again, it's subtle, but everything's going to kind of just shift together a little bit. And the tone isn't going to change that much. That's the important thing. It's not much of a tonal shift. Okay. So here's before.
Night we spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're ringing.
And here's after.
Night we spent together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you, but you're ringing. Night we
So
spent
before?
together, they've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet
After.
now without you, but you're ringing. Night we spent together.
One more time. Before.
They've left me with tinnitus.
You hear that sound? There's a lot more in the low mids. There's a lot more clutter down there. It's harder to hear. Like the bass is kind of overpowering everything. Hard to hear the vocals. Bass kind of lays in a little bit. Drums come out a little bit, but they sound like they're in the background. Vocals come out a little bit. That's the big thing. The tone didn't really change that much. You know, it's not like whenever I came and I did this. Like if I did this, that's really obvious. That's a pretty massive tonal shift. This is just causing everything to play nicely. It's not the final step of all this. Again, we'll get into the final step in a moment, but it is creating the best foundation possible. So let's talk about how I picked what I picked. It's a little bit different for every instrument, but there's really two main ways that I picked where I wanted to boost and where I wanted to cut. So first of all, in order to keep this simple, I actually decided to not, excuse me, I decided to not have my boosts and cuts be random. So I decided to not have it where I'm sweeping across the frequency spectrum, trying to find the place that sounds the absolute best, finding it, boosting it, trying to find the place that sounds the absolute worst, finding it, cutting it. Not only does that take a lot of time and a lot of decision-making energy, but also it kind of ends up changing the tone a little bit more. Because it starts to become a little bit more of a shape EQ. You're shaping the tone. So what I've done instead is I've said, okay, there are six different areas of the frequency spectrum. There is the sub bass, there is the bass, there is the low mids, there are the mids, there is the upper mids, and there are the highs. So 6, I had it right. I am going to boost in one of those, I'm going to cut in one of those, and everything else I'm going to put a shelf on. Now, the reason I'm doing that, rather than just doing, a shelf on the whole thing, I want one area to really get out of the way, if I can. And that area is usually the area that I know another instrument is living in, or an area that I know the instrument that I'm working with is really overpowering. So this bass, for instance, we've had many times where we have said, oh man, it's all good, but that bass is really overpowering. It's really loud. And yes, I should definitely go and turn the volume down for sure. That's not me saying that I shouldn't do that. I actually should do that. Part of the reason was because I didn't have that on. Oops. Let me go and do that really quickly. There's a few. Yeah, that's just a volume thing. But the other reason is because there's a lot of low mid energy in this particular bass. It's just a little bit too much. It sounds great in solo. That's the big thing. It sounds really good in solo. But in context of the rest of the mix, it floods the mix with low mid energy, and it's hard to hear any other instrument in that area. So I was like, okay, let's make a little bit of a cut there. Not too aggressive. It's a wide cut. It's a Q of 1. And I didn't sweep around. I was just kind of low mid area is around 250-ish. I think I might have swept around a little bit, and I was just kind of here, turned it down. And then I had the thought, okay, well, where can I boost? So then I started to decide, okay, what is an area that this bass is lacking in that it would help this bass to stick out in the mix a little bit more, stick out healthily in the mix a little bit more, if it had a little bit more energy in this area. And then I also think, is this an area where tons of instruments are living in? Like if I've boosted in the mids in tons of instruments, I probably shouldn't boost in the mids here also. I do think I actually boosted in the mids here on a lot of the guitars, so that might not be perfect on this particular mix, but usually that's what I would do. And then everything else, I'm just wanting it to get out of the way. I'm not wanting to shape it. I don't want it to have a curvature or anything like that. Top is gone, bottom is gone just a little bit. And then again, I make sure I'm going to go in, I'm going to do my gain staging. So we'll do a quick before and after. So let's solo this out and then look at our VU meter. I'll turn this up so it's easy to see. So kind of 1 to 0. Turn this on. So obviously I've lost about, it's probably sitting 5 to 3, so probably 4 decibels. Somewhere like here. Great. So I'll turn it off, turn it on. So you hear how that doesn't really change the tone that dramatically? But because I've made sure that the gain staging is done correctly, the loudness is exactly the same. So whenever I turn on all of these space EQs, nothing should really go down in volume or up in volume. Certain things will become more obvious or more present for sure, but something shouldn't just like drop off the face of the earth. Looks like Daedalus has some questions. Do you use any templates to give yourself starting points for any of this cutting and boosting, like a low mid cut template that you can load when you think that's the area to cut? Or is it just as well to do it all manually as you go? I think it's totally based on your preference. I am a big fan of templates. So I actually recommend creating just like your own presets, basically. So I might say, oh yeah, this is my preset for mid boost, low mid cut. And I'd save that as a preset. And then I might save another one for mid boost, low cut or something like that. And the nice thing about that is I'll have a nice list right here of all of my options, and I can just click on that, see if it sounds good, and I can move on. So I think that's a very, very good way of doing that. I don't do that personally. If I'm being honest with you, not because I have a good reason. I just don't. And if you work faster and you don't do it that way, that's totally fine. It's not going to help or hurt you. But if you can work faster just by having a button to click and you're able to listen to it and you're able to say, that sounds pretty good, maybe I'll make a few tweaks and I'll gain stage it. Or you can say, yeah, I don't like that at all, let's try another one. Then that's fine too. Either one works for you. You can make your own presets. It's very easy. I would make sure not to do any boosts or cuts more than 3 decibels if you can avoid it, because then you're going to start getting into tonal change at that point. So this is why I did the boosts and cuts where I did. This particular bass felt like it could use a little bit more in the mids. It could live in the mids. Didn't really want a ton of that. And it's crazy to say like, oh man, I cut in the bass frequencies. I know, like, that's insane. The nice thing about that is that I can always boost them later in the final step, the tweak step, if I still think I need a little bit more juice from that. Because the last step is almost your potpourri step, but we'll get to that in a moment. That process is pretty much the same across the board. We've already talked about this. I've got a boost here. I've got a cut here. Everything else is a shelf. For the snare, got a boost here, I've got a cut here. This is nothing. Everything else is a shelf, so on and so forth. And everything across the board is gain staged. That's really important. I'm going to keep drilling that into your heads. Gain stage, gain stage, gain stage, gain stage when you do your EQs. And if you can, gain stage with a VU meter or a loudness meter of some kind. So that's really all it is. This step is really nice because A, it forces you to listen to everything in context. That's really important. You never, never, never want to solo while you're doing this step ever, unless you're doing gain staging because you have to solo during that, but that's just for a utility's sake. So it forces you to do all this EQ in terms of the rest of the instruments in the mix. You can pretty much instantly hear if this helps or hurts, which is great. Excuse me. And then the nice thing about it, again, is it is a step. You do it all at the same time. You can turn it all on. You can turn it all off. I like to have all of them at the exact same place in the frequency range if you can, because then you can select everything, turn it off if you need to. That is basically the end of our, how would I put this? This is the end of the structured part of this painter technique. So we have gone through, and basically what we've done, we've made the best possible foundation we could. You know, we got rid of all of our resonant frequencies. We made sure that every single instrument had a balanced tone, had the best tone it could. We made sure that the whole mix had a tonal curve that matched our reference. We made sure that all of the instruments sat as good together as possible. That's our foundation. That is our EQ foundation. It's done. The fifth step is your miscellaneous step, basically. So the fifth step is the step that all of you are probably used to, which is, I guess I gotta just go EQ it. This is your problem solving step. This is the step where you're going to use your ears really intently and you're going to listen to your mix and you're going to say, okay, what is still a problem? What is still sticking out? What is still too far in the back? What still sounds gross? What needs to sound more exciting? This is the step that you're going to go and do that. So you are going to basically, this might even be going and cutting somewhere where you boosted in previous steps. That's okay. Because for the first time, you are saying, I am problem solving actively. I'm actively using my ears to problem solve in terms of the mix. So it's okay if I boosted in the upper mids at step 2 whenever I was making the instrument sound great, and I'm going to cut in the upper mids here. That's fine. That's totally fine. It'd be the same thing if the engineer from, you know, a professional tracking session did a bunch of pre-tape EQ, like we talked about before, sent it off to the mixing engineer, and then the mixing engineer said, this guitar sounds great, but there's too much upper mids, and it's masking everything. I need to take it down in context of the mix. That's totally okay. If you just cut a whole bunch of bass out during the creating space step that we just did, step 4. If you just took out a bunch of bass in your bass guitar or your kick and you're listening and you're like, man, it just needs more bass. That's okay. Go back, find a very specific area that you want to boost it a little bit if you got to. Make sure that you do your gain staging, but boost it a little bit. Really, like, this is where I'm not necessarily going to be able to teach you how to do this, because this is where it gets down to practice. This is where it gets down to like using every single EQ whatever thing you've ever learned, and saying, I'm going to go in and make this brighter, and I'm going to make this thinner so that it fits in with everything, and I'm going to make this more aggressive so that it sticks out, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. You know, this is the step where also, this is when you're going to be doing, like, you've already done your compression at this point. You've probably done some saturation at this point. You've done a lot of your mix at this point. You might not have gone in and done your reverbs or anything like that, but like your mix is there. So for me, I didn't need to do a ton of that on this mix. I definitely needed to look at the overheads and the rooms. I will say, so it looks like Daedalus has another question. Let me actually hit that before we move on. Is there ever a case, so this is what he's asking, is there ever, or she, excuse me, is there ever a case where you would deliberately push things together into the same spot in the frequency spectrum in order to blend them and make them stand out less? Yes, you can do that. It's a little bit more of an advanced technique, so I don't know if I'd recommend doing that if you're just learning, but that is definitely a strategy you can do. Sometimes you might have two instruments that actually feel like they are too separated. Maybe you kind of want them to be sort of like a mishmash of sounds, or maybe you want them to almost sound like they're coming from one instrument instead of two. For instance, if I am recording this is a weird example, but if I'm recording an orchestra, I might not want every single instrument to stick out super well. I might want all of the violins to blend together, or all the violins and the violas to blend together, or the bass and the cello to blend together. That would be a time that I might want to boost both of them in the lower mids, or both of them in the upper mids, or something like that. Because I'm not necessarily trying to create space to make it more obvious where each instrument sits. I'm trying to almost smear over them. Now that is more of a specific use case, not something I do on everything, not even something I do on every mix. But if I think smear is a good way of putting it. If I'm trying to smear colors together, going back to our painter method, if I'm trying to smear a bunch of colors together, that's something that you definitely can do if you would like. But I would be very careful with it because it can go wrong pretty quick. Fresh Meat says, oh man, trying to mix orchestra must be another level of difficult. Yeah, it's not fun. I've done it. It's hard. But also, usually the people who are recording the orchestra usually know what they're doing. So it's hard to mix badly recorded orchestra. It's not super hard to mix well-recorded orchestra because it's usually just more subtle stuff. I'm not being too aggressive. Anyway, not to get off on all that. So, let's talk about some of the tweaks that I made. So first off, one thing that we've said many times is, man, the mix bus EQ that we used helped the overall sound a lot, but it definitely made a few things sound too harsh, too aggressive. One of the big things we said were the cymbals. The cymbals really started to stand out more. So I went in here, and you can see I made some cuts. I cut a little bit out of this part of the upper mids, and all I did was I just listened, grabbed this, swept around a little bit. This one was the one that hurt the most. Cut it a little bit. And then I believe, I don't actually remember why I cut this originally, but I think it was just maybe being a little bit too muddy. But this helped quite a bit. So let me take this out, and we will show you how to do this sweep EQ technique right now. So take this up, sweep it around. Yeah, definitely right here. Listen to that. Very harsh. Hold on. So not having to do much at all, just a few dB cut. It's not the widest cut. It's a pretty thin cut, but it helps a lot. So I'll take this out and then take it back in, and you'll be able to hear the difference. Especially once I take out the the room mic one. I'll actually add in the room mic one as well because I did some similar EQing, some much more aggressive EQing in the upper mids for that. So let me just do both at the same time so you'll hear. So here is before. Here's after. Really just pushes it back, puts it right where it needs to be. So before and after. And it's not because it's turning the drums down. The drums are the same loudness. It's just getting rid of some of those harsh frequencies that are really harsh and present to our ears. Looks like there is another question. So John says, I got Waves audio tracks, basic EQ and gain, but as basic it doesn't eat up your limited CPU, so you can use it on analog tracks. Yeah, that's Waves makes good stuff, good cheap stuff. If you're just getting started buying plugins, Waves is definitely a good place to start. Yes, and Fresh Meat is asking if there's going to be a recap. There's definitely going to be a recap because we're starting to really reel this in. We're getting towards the end. So let's look at what else we did. I think this was just a stereo thing. So I went in here. It looks like I thought that this particular electric guitar, which let's find out which one it was. So this one, the one during the chorus, this particular electric guitar had a little bit too much mid energy. So I decided to go in here and turn it on, turn it off. So I'm not going to solo that. I'm going to take it in context. So it's subtle, but I remember just listening to it and being like, man, this is just sticking out too much. And it just makes it a little bit less plinky. And again, one of the nice things is that, I turned this down by almost 3 decibels. And all I had to do is turn this up by about half a dB. So everything else got half a dB louder. So all the other frequencies became more present. Almost like a compressor a little bit. It's like all the quieter stuff got just a little bit louder. And this thing that I wanted to be quieter got quieter. It's great. Let's see what I did here. What instrument is this? Oh, yes. So I felt like this guitar wasn't sticking out as much as it needed to. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So this particular solo right here, very aggressive. And then the next solo, because it has so much reverb on it from their guitar pedals, it really sticks into the back of the mix. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So this right here, very forward, very in your face. That feels like it's a lot farther away. It's part of the way I decided to fix it. And as I went into the upper mids, which again, that's where a lot of the presence is, and I decided to boost it. And that also just helps me to balance the tones between one solo and the other solo a little bit as well. And the same thing, you can see it's pretty wide Q. It's Q of 1, if I'm doing any kind of boost, it's usually a pretty wide Q. I'm not doing any like tiny, very narrow boosts. I might do that for cuts, but not so much for boosts. So that just helps balance those two solos together. Other than that, I don't believe, at least for this demo mix, I actually did any other cuts. If I was to go back, I might actually do some cuts more for the vocals, because they also got just a little bit harsh once I put on my mix bus EQ. But for now, especially considering that I haven't done any other mixing at all, I'm thinking this is sounding pretty good. So I want to go and listen to what it sounds like now, and then I'm going to go and listen to what it sounded like at the beginning before we started all of this, just to remind your ears how far we've come without doing any other mixing. So this is after. We're going to start with after.
Ringing through the silence, all these nights we spent
I'm just going to let it go
together.
for a bit.
They've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you. But you're ringing through the silence, all these nights we spent together. They've left me with tinnitus, and it's quiet now without you. But you're ringing.
Okay, now let's listen to what we were doing before. I'm actually going to take these over here for a moment. Okay, so here's where we started. So much duller. It's so much less in your face. Everything is smeared. Nothing is standing apart. It's boring. I mean, ultimately, like, it's boring. It's a boring sound. But then you go in and you do all of this EQ, and you hear the sounds of your hard work instantly. Now it sounds like a mix. And that's it. Then you go and you do your compression. Then you go and you do your reverbs. Then you go and you do your delays, your saturations, your cool effects, your automation. This needs a lot of volume automation. It's just all of a sudden you have a balanced frequency spectrum, a balanced tone for the first time. And you are able to take it one step at a time instead of having to just throw an EQ on something and say, I don't know, I guess it sounds too muddy. I should cut some of the mud. That's not to say that you shouldn't do that, but the fact that you are able to do so much of the EQ work in those first 4 steps before you ever get to your final miscellaneous problem solving step makes it infinitely easier to problem solve. You know, I didn't really do that much problem solving, like we talked about before. I didn't do that much in step 5. But had I started on step 5, oh my gosh, every EQ plugin would have just been so full of boosts and cuts, and it would have taken me so long, and I would have felt so lost. It would have been a lot more difficult for me to sit down and listen and think, like, there's 18 million things I have to do right now. What do I even start on? Where do I even start? So if you're just starting EQ, or if you're constantly stressed out by EQ, if you never understand EQ, use this system. It's going to be so helpful for you. Sharon asks, so none of these tracks had compression on them originally? Nope. None of them were compressed. Totally dry. No compression at all, outside of the natural compression of like a guitar amp. That is just the thing that happens normally. So let's review what we have gone over. We're going to be bringing this stream to a close. We're bringing this workshop to a close. If you haven't been taking notes, maybe this is the time to do it. 5 steps. 5 steps to the painter method. First step, clean your tracks or prepare your tools if you're thinking about the painter method. That's going to be cutting your resonance frequencies, cutting anything super nasty. That's your surgical EQ. Step 2, enhance your instruments or sketch each object on the canvas. This is where you're EQing in solo. You're making sure that every instrument sounds the best it can before you start your mix. This is pre-mixing. This is your pre-tape EQ, to put it in terms of 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s professional studio. Step 3, balance your mix's tone, or put paint on the canvas. Start putting paint on the canvas. This is where we are listening to our reference mixes. Really, we should be listening to our reference mixes the whole time. That's a bit of a given, but we're extra listening to our reference mixes. We are listening and seeing what are the differences. We are trying to figure out, is it brighter? Is it darker? Is it muddier? What is the problem with the frequency spectrum, the overall tone, not just like, oh, this instrument is too harsh, but the overall tone. What's the problem that we can do a lot of work on right now on our mix bus to solve? That is going to give you your general outline. Then we moved on to step 4, which is creating space for your instruments to live in the frequency spectrum, or in terms of the painter, that is creating depth with shading, shadows. That is going to be us doing our range allocation, which is our one boost, our one cut, and our shelves. Then we have finally our 5th step, which is to make your final tweaks. This is our problem solving step. This is when we are going through, we're listening to the whole mix, we're saying, okay, our foundation is great. This is too harsh. This is too muddy. This is too this. This is not enough this. We're picking out very specific problems and we are solving those problems with EQ. That is the 5-step program. That is the painter method. If you're able to follow that and you practice it, practice is really important. It's not going to be the best thing you've ever done on the first time. If you practice it over and over again, you're going to become a pro at mixing so much faster than if you were just throwing EQs on stuff and moving faders up and down and just hoping and praying that it works. The only other thing I do, again, want to make sure that I am reviewing, I've said it 18 million times, please, 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 please gain stage your EQs. It's so important to your mix. No one does it. It makes me so mad. Not mad like at the person, just mad that no one teaches it. VU meters, there's free ones out there. The MV meter 2 is a really solid one. Really, that's a great way to do your gain staging based on loudness, not on volume, because loudness is what matters. We have a few questions, looks like, so I'm going to go over here and answer this. So when using this technique in a mix, do you do a preliminary level balance? This is Daedalus, by the way. A preliminary level balance, then this EQing, then compression, and then everything else. This is a great question because the order that you do mixing in is very important. It's different for everybody. Again, like it's just system based, whatever system you use. I would definitely use a system. If you don't use a system, use a system. Don't do all this stuff randomly. But whatever system you use, you've got to fit it into there. Here's what I would do. First off, step 1 and 2. So that's cleaning your tracks and enhancing your instruments. Pre-mix. So before you go in and you do your volume balance, I just would go solo every instrument, listen to it, find the problems, cut them out. Maybe listen to your reference tracks, see what the guitars sound like, try to match that. Or even just to your own ears, you're like, oh yeah, this guitar is way too dull, try to fix that. And then what I would do is I would bounce those tracks as new tracks. And I think someone actually might have mentioned that. Yeah, Hank looks like said, would you bounce down every track now, re-import it, do compression and stuff like that? So I'll get into, that's a more complicated question, but he does mention this. So anything that I do on my tracks pre-mix, so before I get my hands dirty on the mix, so like for instance, any editing that I do, this is also pre-mix. So if I do any vocal tuning, if I do any phase alignment, if I do any rhythm editing, rhythm tightening, if I clean the tracks at all, like I'm cutting noise out and I'm doing my fades and my crossfades, anything like that that's pre-mix, I would do what's known as a bounce in place. At least that's what they call it in Logic. You might have to Google this on your DAW. I would do that to basically wipe the slate clean and start your mix fresh. So, for example, let's say this electric guitar, I have all of this that I've done during my pre-mix. So I've not started mixing. I haven't done my volume balance really yet. I would go here on Logic. Again, this is going to be different for every DAW. Please Google this on your own DAW. But I would right-click it, and I'd go to Bounce in Place. And bounce is just a fancy word for export. And what that's going to do, I'm going to make sure I don't have bypass effect plugins checked, is that is basically going to commit my EQ to the audio. So you can see, I'm going to go to my mixer. So here's the old audio right here. Here's the new audio. The old audio has all this EQ on it as a plugin. The new audio doesn't. But if I soloed them out, they're going to sound exactly the same. So what that does is, A, it's going to save you on a ton of CPU. And B, it's going to allow you to, it's going to keep you from having to stress about having to go back and make a bunch of changes to stuff, which the less cluttered you can make your session, the better, because you're having to make so many tiny decisions. The more decisions you make, the more stressed you become. The more stressed you become, the slower it is to mix. The slower it is to mix, the less accurate your ears become. The less accurate your ears become, the worse the mix is. It's a domino effect. So it's helpful with stress levels. It's helpful with allowing you to just focus on very specific decision makings that you have to do right then. It's helpful for CPU usage. You don't use CPU as much. And there was one other one. Yeah, I can't remember. There was one other one, but it just gets a bunch of plugins out of the way. It keeps it from maybe having some glitching issues. That happens to me a lot, especially with my vocal tuning or my rhythm editing. I don't like having that there while I mix, because there's been so many times when I've gone into mixing with that there and I've accidentally deleted something and all of it was gone and I had to start over, and I hate doing that. So would definitely do this stuff pre-mix, would definitely bounce that track, and then either delete this, or what I usually do is I'll move it to, I'll just move it out of the session. And you can, at least in Logic, you can turn things off and hide them. So I'll just turn the track off so it's not processing. I'll hide it. And then boom, it's gone, which is really helpful. So we'll definitely do that pre-mix. Let me get back to where I was, which is there. I would start your mix by doing a volume balance. That's the first thing I would do. Then right after that, I would set up your mix bus processing. So that's going to be your mix bus EQ, as well as any mix bus compression or saturation, anything that you put on there. Then after that, I would do either your compression or your space EQ, your step 4. I would do that. And then I would save that final EQ for once you've gotten sort of your general mix done. So you've gotten your compression finished, you've gotten the bulk of your EQ finished, your saturation is kind of done. I would do it before you do reverbs or delays. I would also do it before you do any panning. I realize that I have a bunch of panning on here. I usually actually do all my EQ in mono. It makes it a lot harder, but the end result is almost always better sounding, because it forces you to create a lot more space, because you can't just throw stuff into the left and the right speaker. That's the order I would do that in. And then once you've done that, you're done with EQ. You can go off, do all your effects, do your reverbs, do your panning. You'll probably have to go back and tweak EQ a lot. Or if you want to do like a creative EQ effect, you'll do that. But at least for me, that's the order that I would do it in. So first two steps, pre-mix, then step 3, then step 4, then compression and all the other stuff, and then step 5. So hopefully that answers your question. So Hank, to get back on this, so you were saying, would you bounce down every track now, re-import it, do compression saturation, just to save CPU? So I would bounce down the stuff that I did in premix. I would not bounce down the stuff that I did for all of it, because I might want to go back and tweak some of it. You can if you want, that's fine. A lot of people do that. You obviously can't bounce your mix bus EQ, but a lot of people will just bounce all their EQs and then go and do their compression. I don't do that. I mean, if you're really struggling on CPU usage, then like, sure. If you want to do your shape EQ and bounce that down, you can. But I wouldn't do your shape EQ until you at least have your volume balance and your mix bus EQ done. So for me, like, I've already moved on from the time that I usually bounce everything down, so I don't do that. But you can if that works in your workflow. That was probably very loud. Sharon asks, would it be a good idea to start with low-end issues in stage 4? I usually save that for stage 5 myself. But yeah, I mean, I will oftentimes do stage 4 low-end stuff as well. I mean, if you can see, go in here. Oh, that's not that. That's well, actually, no, it looks like I didn't. Yeah, I would actually save that probably for step 5. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong doing it in step 4, because honestly, like, that's the thing that that's the step where you get everything to fit together. It's just, for me, balancing low end takes more thinking work, and for me, step 4 is a little bit less thinking work. Like, for me, fixing my low end is more problem solving, and I usually just save all my problem solving stuff, my general problem solving stuff, for the last stage. So again, like, it kind of depends what you want, what you do, but for me, that's the step that I would do that in. So so Mark asks, before the bounce in place, do you create a new alternative? You can. I don't usually mess with alternatives. I should. There's some things that, like, I'll have students tell me, like, oh, you do this thing, right? And I'm always like, oh, I should do that, but I don't. Alternatives are great. For people who don't know, it's just basically, it's almost like a different way of doing like a save as, and saving it as a whole nother track. I will save a new session every time I move from one big step to the next. So, like, if I'm writing, recording, editing, mixing, and mastering a song, I will have a session for every one of those. I'll have a write session, then I'll save as, I'll have a record session, save as, I'll have an edit session, save as, so on and so forth, so that if I need to go back and reference stuff, I can. Like, I don't lose everything. But I don't use alternatives. So, up to you. If you want to do that, awesome. It's not going to hurt you at all. John asks, please show how to get to the bounce in place command. You missed the first part. Yeah. So honestly, like, the way I do it, I hardly ever right click on much of anything, just because I know a lot of keystrokes. It is Control B. In logic, again, it's going to be different in every DAW, but for logic, it's Control B. You can see that this pops up, bounce regions in place. That's helpful for me because I know like the general export button for logic is Command B. So that's just helpful for me to know because like I just know they're both B and I've practiced it. But as far as the right click, it is here in bounce and join. So bounce in place is right there. Cool. So we are going to wrap this up here. I hope everyone's learned a lot. I hope that all of this has made sense. We are most likely going to be sending out a survey to all of you to fill out, talk about the things that you really love, the things you learned, maybe the things you disagreed with, maybe the things you didn't understand or that just didn't come across very easily. Would really love you to be brutally honest on that. We are considering making a course on this concept. And, you know, like I just want to make sure that I'm teaching this to the best of my ability if we do end up making that course. So, very, very thankful for all of you. Thankful that you're all here, that you all share the same passion as I do for all this stuff. I'm really happy that I can help teach you out. Or rather, I can really help. Oh my God. I'm really thankful that I can help you out and teach you. English is hard. But I hope everyone has a great rest of your week. I'm sure I will be talking to you all soon. If anyone is doing the coaching session tomorrow through the membership, I will be handling that. So I'll be seeing you tomorrow. And yeah, have a great day, everyone. Cheers.